Part 1. Red Dust and a Wax-Sealed Letter. The wind that scoured the valley floor of the Idaho Territory tasted of dust and distant snow. It was a thin, sharp wind, one that found its way through the seams of Eliza Burns' worn wool dress and chilled the hope she had nurtured all the way from St. Louis. That hope had been a small, flickering candle, and with every mile the stagecoach jolted west, the wilderness threatened to snuff it out. Dry Creek Station wasn't a town. It was a scar of civilization on an otherwise untamed landscape, a squat trading post, a stable, and a corral, all huddled together as if for warmth against the looming, gray-blue shoulders of the mountains. The pines that climbed the slopes were dark and dense, and the sky above was a pale, unforgiving blue. It was a place that promised hardship before it ever offered welcome. When the stagecoach groaned to a halt, its leather springs sighing in relief, Eliza was the last to descend. The other passengers, a trio of prospectors reeking of sweat and cheap whiskey, scrambled out with a rough familiarity, leaving her to navigate the high step alone. She landed with a soft thud, the red dust immediately powdering the hem of her dark green skirt. For a moment, she just stood there, clutching her small valise, a woman of 24 who looked both younger and older than her years. The fever that had swept through St. Louis 2 years prior had stolen the life from her family's dressmaking shop, and, according to the whispers that followed her like a shadow, it had stolen her future as well. Barren, the doctor had murmured, a word that had branded itself onto her soul. Her intended, a Mr. Alistair Abernathy, had not seemed to mind. His letters were brief, practical. He owned a claim. He wrote. He was building a cabin. He needed a wife to make it a home. He had paid her passage. For Eliza, whose hands were skilled with a needle but whose prospects in the city had dwindled to nothing. His proposal was a lifeline. It was a chance to build something new, far from the pitying glances and the suffocating memory of failure. She scanned the handful of men gathered outside the station. None of them stepped forward. There was no one holding a sign, no one whose face matched the vague, hopeful image she had constructed in her mind. A knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. The stage driver, a burly man with a tobacco-stained beard, heaved her trunk down from the roof with a grunt. "That's it for you, miss," he said, not unkindly. "Dry Creek." He didn't wait for a reply. Already moving to lead his weary horses toward the stable, Eliza was left standing beside her meager, worldly possessions, the silence of the vast landscape pressing in on her. The station master, a wiry old man named Jedediah Mills with eyes the color of faded denim, eventually ambled out of the trading post. He wiped his hands on a burlap apron, his gaze flicking from Eliza to her trunk and back again. "You'd be Miss Byrne?" he asked, his voice raspy. "I am," she confirmed, relief making her voice tremble slightly. "I'm here to meet Mr. Abernathy. Is he delayed?" Jedediah didn't meet her eyes. He stared at a point somewhere over her shoulder, at the jagged peak of the mountain that locals called Bear's Spine. He chewed on the inside of his cheek for a long moment. "Best you come inside, miss," he said finally. The interior of the trading post smelled of salt pork, leather, and wood smoke. Sacks of flour and beans were stacked against one wall, and shelves behind a rough-hewn counter held tins of coffee, spools of wire, and boxes of cartridges. In the dim light, Eliza could make out a few other figures. A woman with a tired face haggling quietly over a bolt of calico, and in the corner, a man sitting alone, his back to the wall. He was large but carried his size with a stillness that made him seem part of the room's shadows. His hat was pulled low, but she saw the line of a faded scar that cut across his forehead and disappeared into his hairline. He seemed to be paying them no mind, nursing a cup of what she assumed was coffee. Jedediah moved behind the counter and pulled a letter from a small wooden box. It was a letter she recognized. She had sent it from Cheyenne to announce her final approach. but the wax seal was broken, and the front was marked with a single, brutal word in black ink: returned. "There was a situation up at the Silver Queen mine," Jedediah began, pushing the letter across the counter. "A bad one. Tunnel collapse a week past." Eliza's blood ran cold. She didn't need him to finish. She knew, with the leaden certainty of someone long accustomed to misfortune, what he was going to say. "Alistair Abernathy was one of the men we lost," Jedediah said, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "I'm sorry, Miss, truly sorry. He'd left this here for you. A deposit. He called it for the mail order arrangement." He gestured to the letter, which now felt less like a message and more like an epitaph. Her contract, her future, returned to sender. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing down on her. The tired woman at the counter glanced over, her eyes filled with a weary pity that was almost worse than scorn. The whisper started then, a sibilant hiss that seemed to emanate from the very walls. It passed from the woman to her husband, who had just entered, and then to a pair of trappers examining axe handles. The bride? Abernathy's bride. Poor soul. All this way for a dead man. The bride nobody wanted. That last phrase struck her like a physical blow. It echoed the whispers from St. Louis, confirming her deepest fear she was an unwanted thing. A piece of damaged goods. Humiliation burned hot in her cheeks. She wanted to shrink, to disappear, to be swallowed whole by the vast, indifferent wilderness outside. Her trance of despair was broken by a new presence at her side. A man had moved from the shadows of the bartering area, his scent a mix of sawdust and something sharp, like pine resin. He was tall, with a lean, wolfish build, and his eyes, a startlingly dark blue, held a calculating glint. He smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Tynan Crow, he introduced himself, his voice smooth as oiled leather. He gestured vaguely toward Eliza's trunk. "Abernathy owed me a considerable sum, as he's unavailable to settle his accounts. Perhaps we can discuss the terms of his outstanding arrangements. I'm a reasonable man." His gaze roamed over her, not as a man looks at a woman, but as a rancher inspects livestock. He was not offering condolences. He was assessing an asset. Eliza felt a wave of nausea. She understood instantly. Abernathy hadn't just paid her passage. He had used her as collateral. She wasn't a bride-to-be. She was a debt to be collected. "I have no arrangement with you, sir," she said, her voice small but firm. Crow's smile widened. "The contract says otherwise. Jedediah has it, a simple transfer of property." Jedediah looked profoundly uncomfortable. "Now, Tynan, that ain't right. The man is dead. The contract is void." "The deposit is not," Crow countered, his voice losing its silken edge. "I'm out a good deal of money. The girl can work it off. I've got a roadhouse over in Prudence Gulch that could use a new laundress. Or a barmaid." The implication hung heavy and foul in the air. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. She was trapped. No money, no return passage. No one to turn to. Here, on the edge of the world, a man like Crow operated by his own laws. She backed away a step, her knuckles white where she gripped her valise. Her mind raced, searching for an escape that wasn't there. She could beg Jedediah for shelter, but for how long? A day a week she would become a charity case, the town burden. The thought was intolerable. It was then that the man in the corner finally moved. He rose from his chair not quickly, but with a deliberate, unhurried motion that drew every eye in the room. He placed his empty cup on the counter with a quiet click. Pushing his hat back slightly, he revealed the full length of the scar. It was old, white against his tanned skin, and it gave his otherwise stoic face a dangerous history. His eyes, a calm and steady gray, settled first on Tynan Crow, then on Eliza. He didn't speak to Crow at all. His gaze rested on her, and for the first time she felt seen as a person. Not a problem or a piece of property. This was Calder Holt, Cal as the few who knew him called him. A man who had left the clang of the mines and the crash of falling timber behind to carve out a life on the high, lonely slopes of Bear's Spine. He came down to Dry Creek a few times a season for salt, ammunition, and coffee, and otherwise kept to himself. He was known for his patience and his silence in equal measure. He looked at Eliza's trunk, then at her pale, determined face. He noted the fine, precise stitching on the collar of her worn dress, the hands that were clean and capable despite her journey. He saw the terror in her eyes, but beneath it, a spine of steel. Then he looked past her, through the open doorway, at the sky. The sun was slanting low, painting the clouds in bruised shades of purple and orange. The wind had picked up, carrying a biting chill that spoke of a sudden, early turn in the weather. Tynan Crow took a half-step forward, placing himself between Cal and Eliza. "This is my business. Holt, stay out of it." Cal didn't even glance at him. His focus remained on Eliza. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and rough, like stones tumbling in a riverbed. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't an offer of rescue. It was a simple statement of fact. "Get in the wagon." Eliza stared at him, confused. He gave a slight nod toward the door, where a sturdy buckboard wagon was tethered, a large draft horse patiently waiting. "My wagon. Load your trunk." He paused, his gray eyes holding hers. "Storm's coming to the mountain tonight? A bad one." The room was utterly silent. Crow's face darkened with fury, but he hesitated. Calder Holt was not a man to be trifled with. He wore no gun on his hip, but there was an authority in his stance, a quiet promise of capability that was more intimidating than any Colt revolver. For Eliza, it was a choice between two unknowns. One was a predator who saw her as chattel. The other was a stranger, a silent mountain man with a scarred face and eyes that held no discernible emotion. To accept his help was to trade one form of dependency for another, to put herself in debt to a man she knew nothing about. Her pride rebelled. She had not come all this way to be a burden, a piece of luggage to be claimed and carried off. But then another gust of wind rattled the station's window frames, and the light outside dimmed perceptibly. The air grew heavy, pregnant with snow. The mountain, Bear's Spine, was already disappearing behind a gray veil. Nature, it seemed, was making the decision for her. To stay here was to remain in Crow's orbit. To go with this stranger was a chance. Without another word, Cal turned and walked out of the trading post. He didn't look back to see if she would follow. He expected her to. Eliza took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and fear and a tiny, inexplicable grain of trust. She looked at Jedediah, who gave her a short, almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. She looked at Tynan Crow, whose face was a mask of thwarted greed. Then, with her head held high, she walked out of the trading post and into the biting wind. Cal was already untying the reins of his horse. He didn't offer to help as she struggled with the heavy trunk, wrestling it toward the back of the buckboard. It was a test. She realized. He was watching. Gritting her teeth, she managed to heave one end onto the wagon bed. Only then did he move, taking the other end and sliding the trunk into place with an easy strength that belied his lean frame. He held out a hand to help her up onto the seat. His palm was rough, calloused, the hand of a man who worked with wood and stone. She placed her hand in his, and for a brief moment, his grip was firm and steady around hers. Then he released her and climbed up on the driver's side. He clicked the reins, and the wagon lurched forward, its wheels crunching on the gravelly earth. They left Dry Creek Station behind, a tiny outpost of fragile lives swallowed by the immense landscape. Neither of them spoke. The silence in the wagon was as vast as the valley around them. Eliza wrapped her thin shawl tighter, her gaze fixed on the darkening trail that led up into the mountains, toward a place called Bear's Spine. toward an unknown future with a silent, scarred stranger. She was no longer a bride-to-be, nor was she Tynan Crow's property. She didn't know what she was. She only knew that she was heading into a storm, in more ways than one, and for the first time in a very long while, she was not entirely alone. Part 2. The House on the Wind's Spine. The climb to Bear's Spine was a battle against gravity and the coming storm. The trail narrowed from a wagon path to little more than a goat track, winding through dense stands of lodgepole pine. Calder Holt handled the horse with a quiet, competent focus, his hands steady on the reins as the buckboard's wheels scraped against rock and lurched through shallow, ice-rimmed creeks. Eliza held tight to the wagon seat, her body swaying with every jolt. The air grew thinner, colder. Below them, the valley floor was a darkening tapestry of brown and gray. But up here, the wind had a voice. It moaned through the pines, a lonely, desolate sound that promised a winter of fierce isolation. She said nothing, sensing that this man was not one for idle talk. He was a creature of his environment, enduring, silent, and shaped by harsh realities. She watched his profile, the hard line of his jaw, the way his gray eyes constantly scanned the trees, the trail, the bruised-looking sky. He was not ignoring her. He was simply occupied with the task of getting them to shelter before the heavens opened up. It was a focus she understood. It was the same concentration she applied to a difficult line of stitches, a problem that could only be solved with patience and steady hands. Just as the first flakes of snow began to drift down, fat and wet and silent, they broke through the tree line into a small clearing, and there it was, Holt's homestead. It was not a place of comfort, but of defiance. A cabin of thick, expertly notched pine logs stood firm against the slope, its stone chimney breathing a thin plume of smoke. A sign he had left a fire banked. Beside it was a small, sturdy stable and a half-dug root cellar, its mounded earth already dusted with white. An unfinished fence of split rails marched 50 yards into the clearing before stopping abruptly, a testament to a job interrupted. It was the work of one man, a life stripped down to its barest essentials: shelter, warmth, and sustenance. Yet there was an order to it all. The woodpile was stacked with a mason's precision. The tools leaning against the cabin wall were clean and cared for. It was a solitary life, but not a careless one. Cal brought the wagon to a halt near the cabin door. "We're here," he stated, the words seeming loud in the snow-muffled quiet. He swung down and, without waiting for her, began to unhitch the horse. Eliza climbed down, her legs stiff and cold. She took her valise and stood for a moment, feeling like an extraneous piece of furniture left out in the snow. This was his world, his fortress of solitude, and she was an intruder, a complication he had carried home like a stray. The shame from the trading post washed over her again, cold and sharp. The bride nobody wanted. The words were a bitter catechism in her mind. "Inside," Cal's voice cut through her thoughts. He was leading the horse toward the stable. Stoves warm, wood's in the box next to it. She pushed open the heavy plank door and stepped into the cabin's single room. It was larger than she expected, dominated by a large stone hearth and a black cast-iron stove that radiated a welcome, steady heat. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A bed, neatly made with wool blankets, was built into one corner. Against the far wall were shelves holding a few books, tins of supplies, and neatly folded clothes. High above, a ladder led to a sleeping loft. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and clean pine, like the man himself. The space was Spartan, functional, and devoid of any softness. She placed her valise on the floor and went to the stove, holding her frozen hands out to the warmth. When Cal entered a few minutes later, shaking snow from his hat, he found her there. He didn't seem to know what to do with her presence. He brought her trunk inside, setting it down with a heavy thud that seemed to punctuate her intrusion. "The loft is yours," he said, gesturing with his chin toward the ladder. "There's a mattress and blankets. It's warm up there." "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. The first few days were a study in silent accommodation. The storm descended in full fury, a blizzard that buried the world in a swirling vortex of white. They were trapped. Two strangers in a space meant for one. They moved around each other with a careful, deliberate courtesy. Cal would rise before dawn, his movements quiet as he stoked the fire and put coffee on to boil. Eliza would wait in the loft, feigning sleep until she heard him go out to the stable, giving them both a semblance of privacy. She tried to make herself useful, to earn her keep. She cooked meals from his stores of salted meat, beans, and dried apples. Her food was simple but savory, a vast improvement on his own bachelor fare, though he never said as much. His only comment was to silently pass her his clean plate. She mended a tear in his canvas coat with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She swept the floor, kept the stove fed, and organized his shelves. They were the actions of a housekeeper, and the role chafed at her. It felt too close to servitude, a confirmation of her diminished status. She was haunted by the past, at night, in the quiet of the loft, with the wind howling its mournful song around the eaves. The St. Louis doctor's voice would come back to her. The fever was severe. "Miss Byrne, it's unlikely you'll ever carry a child to term." The pronouncement had been delivered with clinical finality, stripping her of the one thing society valued most in a woman. What good was a wife who could not provide an heir? She was a faulty mechanism, a barren field. She assumed this man, Holt, knew it instinctively, that he looked at her and saw only her incompleteness. Cal, too, was wrestling with ghosts. The forced intimacy of the snowbound cabin was a trial. For years, he had kept the world at arm's length. Solitude was his penance and his shield. In the dead of night, he would sometimes wake in a cold sweat, the smell of damp earth and black powder in his nostrils, the frantic, muffled cries of another man echoing in his memory. It wasn't always the war that came for him. More often, it was the mine, the groan of the shoring timbers, the sudden, deafening roar, and the blackness, the suffocating weight of the earth. He'd clawed his friend, Silas, out with his bare, bloody hands, but the man's mind had been broken by the hours they'd spent buried alive. Cal had survived, but he carried the weight of that darkness with him. He had sworn never again to be responsible for another soul's survival, and now, this woman was here. Her presence was a constant, unnerving reminder of that broken vow. The storm broke after the fourth day. The world outside was transformed, buried under a pristine blanket of white. The sky a brilliant, aching blue. The silence was absolute. That morning, Eliza noticed the cabin's main table wobbled. It was a small thing, but it grated on her sense of order. Finding Cal's toolbox, she located a small hand plane and a wood file. She spent an hour carefully sanding down the uneven leg until the table stood solid and true. When Cal came in for the midday meal, he stopped and looked at the table, then at her. He ran his hand over the smooth, steady surface. He didn't say anything, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, surprise, and perhaps a grudging respect. A fragile truce began to form, built not on words, but on actions. When he saw her struggling to split kindling with a heavy axe, he didn't take it from her. Instead, he brought out a smaller hatchet and showed her how to strike the wood along its grain. A quick, efficient snap of the wrist. When a loose shingle began to clatter in the wind, she pointed it out. He brought the ladder, and she climbed up without hesitation, holding the new shingle in place while he hammered it down, their hands working in tandem against the cold. He began to teach her the language of the mountain. He showed her how to read the patterns of ice on the creek to know where it was safe to cross. He pointed out the tracks of snowshoe hare and deer, and taught her how to set a simple snare. He explained that the fire in the stove was more than comfort. It was life. It must never go out. Each night, He showed her how to bank the coals under a layer of ash, a skill she mastered quickly. These were not lessons in housewifery. They were lessons in survival. He was giving her the means to be independent, and it was the greatest courtesy he could have paid her. A week later, supplies running low, he announced they were going into Prudence Gulch. It was a larger, rougher settlement than Dry Creek, built around the boom and bust cycle of the mines. As their wagon rolled down the main street, a muddy track lined with saloons, a general store, a blacksmith, and an assayer's office, Eliza felt 100 pairs of eyes on her. The whispers followed them like flies. There's Holt, and that's the woman he picked up. Abernathy's mail-order bride, the one left at the station. Heard Tynan Crow had a claim on her. The words were like stones, and she flinched with each one. At the general store, owned by a sharp-eyed but kindly woman named Rosa Pike, the gossip was more subdued but ever-present. Eliza kept her head down, her focus on the list of goods Cal had given her, while she was gathering flour and coffee. Tynan Crow entered. He swaggered in, flanked by 2 of his cronies, his eyes immediately finding her. He ignored Cal completely, addressing Eliza as if she were a runaway horse he'd finally cornered. "Enjoying your mountain holiday?" he asked, his voice dripping with insinuation. "Don't get too comfortable. Our business isn't concluded." Before Eliza could find her voice, Cal stepped quietly between them. He wasn't menacing, but his presence was an impassable wall. "She has no business with you, Crow." "She's part of a debt owed to me," Crow sneered. "Abernathy's contract is with a dead man." Cal cut in, his voice flat and cold, which makes it worthless. "Now, if you're not here to buy anything, you're wasting Mrs. Pike's good air." Crow's hand twitched toward the pistol on his hip, but he thought better of it. He looked from Cal's implacable face to Eliza's frightened one and gave a nasty laugh. "We'll see about that. Holt, we'll see what the circuit judge has to say about the sanctity of a contract." He turned and strode out, his men trailing behind him. The ride back to the homestead was silent and fraught with a new tension. The threat was no longer a vague possibility. It was real and present. Crow would not let it go. Eliza knew she was the cause. A storm cloud of trouble she had dragged to this man's door. That night, as they sat by the fire, the silence stretched until it was threadbare. Finally, she could bear it no longer. "I should leave," she said, staring into the flames. "I won't bring that man's fight to you. I can find work in town, perhaps with Mrs. Pike." Cal looked at her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "Crow owns half the businesses in Prudence Gulch, and what he doesn't own, he frightens. You'd be working for him inside of a week, and you wouldn't be mending clothes." The stark truth of his words left her with nothing to say. She was trapped. He got up and went to a small wooden chest in the corner, from which he took out a ledger book, a pen, and a bottle of ink. He sat back down at the table, the book open between them. "You're right," he said. "You can't stay here as a guest, and I didn't bring you here to be my wife." He stumbled over the word, as if it were foreign. "This needs to be clear, for you, and for anyone like Crow who might ask." He dipped the pen in the ink, his large, calloused hand surprisingly steady as he began to write. Eliza watched, her heart pounding. He was writing out a contract, in plain, concise language. He detailed an agreement. For a period of 3 months, Eliza Byrne would be employed at his homestead. Her duties would include cooking, mending, and general upkeep of the cabin. In exchange, Calder Holt would provide food, shelter, and protection. No other commitments were stated or implied. At the end of the term, she would be paid a small wage from his next sale of timber, and she would be free to leave, with no further obligation from either party. He finished writing and turned the ledger around for her to read. It was a document of profound practicality, a bulwark against the chaos of their situation. It was not an offer of marriage or a declaration of affection. It was a business arrangement, but in its clear-eyed assessment of their predicament. It offered her something she hadn't had since leaving St. Louis, a choice, a path forward. It gave her a defined place in this world, however temporary. Most importantly, it gave her an exit. He was not trapping her. He was giving her a way out. He pushed the pen and ink toward her. "If you agree to the terms." She read it one more time. The stark black ink on the page, a stark contrast to the flowery, deceitful promises of her agreement with Abernathy. This was real. This was honest. She picked up the pen, her hand trembling slightly, and signed her name, Eliza Byrne, below his. The contract lay on the table between them. A silent treaty. Outside, the wind picked up, scraping the branches of the pines against the roof. But inside the small cabin on the spine of the mountain, there was a new and fragile quiet. They had drawn a line, creating a space where they could exist, side by side, for a little while longer. Part 3. The Cold and the Hunter. The signed contract created a curious kind of peace. It laid a foundation of cold, hard fact beneath the unstable ground of their arrangement. With their roles defined, a quiet rhythm established itself on the homestead. Eliza was no longer a guest, and Cal was no longer a reluctant host. They were partners in the shared enterprise of survival. The days were measured by the arc of the low winter sun and the demands of the land. He would spend his days felling timber on the higher slopes, the distant, rhythmic thud of his axe, a steady heartbeat against the silence. She made the cabin her domain, transforming it from a Spartan shelter into a place that held the scent of baking bread and the warmth of a well-tended hearth. They spoke little, but they learned to communicate in the shorthand of shared tasks. A nod from him meant the water barrels were low. The sight of his whetstone on the table meant he'd be hunting at dawn. She, in turn, could signal that a seam in his shirt was about to give with a simple glance, and he would find it expertly mended by evening. A fragile respect was growing between them, a recognition of competence in the other's sphere. Yet, an invisible wall remained the wall of their pasts, of the unspoken questions that hung in the air between them. The first true test of their alliance came not from man, but from nature. The weather turned with a vicious, predatory speed. A storm, far more brutal than the first, swept down from the northern peaks, burying the homestead under 3 feet of snow in a single night. For days, the world was a maelstrom of white, and with the deep snow came hunger. It was Eliza who heard it first, late one night, a sound that cut through the howl of the wind, the frantic, terrified bleating of the 3 sheep Cal kept in a small, 3-sided shed near the stable. Cal was instantly awake, grabbing the heavy Winchester rifle from its pegs over the door. "Wolves," he said, his voice a low growl. "Stay inside. Bar the door behind me." But as he pulled on his heavy coat, Eliza was already moving. She remembered stories her grandfather, a trapper in his youth, used to tell. Panic was the wolf's greatest ally. She grabbed a handful of empty tin cans she'd been saving and quickly threaded a piece of twine through them. "Wait," she said, her voice steady despite the frantic pounding of her heart. "Noise and fire." She snatched a bundle of dried pitch pine kindling from the wood box and a few rags, wrapping them tightly around the ends of sticks. Cal watched her, a questioning look in his eyes, but he didn't stop her. He saw the purpose in her movements, the lack of fear. He went out first, the rifle held ready. The night was a chaos of wind and driven snow, but the scene was starkly illuminated by a full moon veiled in thin cloud. A pack of 5 gray shadows, lean and spectral, were circling the sheep pen. Eliza followed close behind, handing him one of the pitch-soaked torches. He struck a match against the rough log wall, shielding the flame with his body until the torch caught, sputtering to life with a hiss. While he stood guard, his rifle a steady line in the swirling snow. Eliza ran toward the fence line, shaking the string of tin cans. The discordant, metallic clatter cut through the night, an alien sound in the wilderness. The wolves faltered, their attention shifting from the sheep to this new, unnerving disturbance. Then she lit her own torch. Holding it high, she planted it in a snowbank, the flames casting wild, dancing shadows that made the world seem alive with menacing figures. She lit another and another, creating a perimeter of flickering, unpredictable light. The wolves, confused by the noise and wary of the fire, broke off their attack. They hesitated, their yellow eyes glowing in the firelight, then melted back into the darkness of the forest. The immediate danger was over. Cal didn't lower the rifle until the last howl had faded into the wind. He turned to her, his face grim in the torchlight. That was quick thinking. "My grandfather told me they fear what they don't understand," she said, her breath pluming in the frigid air. The next morning, in the cold, clear light of dawn, Cal went out not with his rifle, but with heavy chains and steel traps. He showed her how to find the pack's trails, how to anchor a trap so a panicked animal couldn't drag it away, and how to use moss and snow to mask the scent of the metal and the man. His methods were ancient, practical, and deadly. Her solution had been for the night. His was for the winter. Together, they had protected the homestead. A small victory. But it felt monumental. It was the first thing they had truly built together, a wall of shared resolve against the wild. Their fragile peace was shattered 2 weeks later. A lone rider, a deputy from Prudence Gulch named Miller, made his way up the treacherous trail. He brought supplies from Mrs. Pike, but he also brought a folded, official-looking document. It was a summons from Circuit Judge Wallace Pike, ordering Eliza Byrne to appear at a hearing. The charge was breach of contractual obligation. The plaintiff was Tynan Crow. The deputy, a young man who looked deeply uncomfortable, explained the situation. Crow presented a bill of sale. "Ma'am. Signed by Alastair Abernathy. Says he purchased Abernathy's contract for your services. The judge says it looks legal and binding." Eliza's blood ran cold. "But Abernathy is dead. The contract died with him." Miller shuffled his feet. "Crow argues the debt came first, that you were the payment." Judge Pike, "Well, he and Crow do a lot of business together." The unspoken meaning was clear. The judge had been bought. After the deputy left, a suffocating silence descended on the cabin. This was no longer a matter of whispers or veiled threats. Crow had enlisted the law, twisting it into a weapon to be used against her. She was to be dragged into a courtroom and publicly declared a piece of property. "He can't do this," she whispered, staring at the summons as if it were a coiled snake. Cal took the paper from her trembling hands. His face was granite. "In a proper court. He couldn't," he said, his voice tight with a controlled fury she had never heard before. "But Wallace Pike's court is a long way from proper." That evening, a desperate hope seized Eliza. Abernathy's belongings, packed in a large wooden crate that had traveled with her on the stagecoach, had been stored in the corner of the stable. She'd had no heart to go through the possessions of a dead man she'd never met. But now, she thought there might be something, a letter, a journal, anything that might prove the personal nature of their arrangement, something to refute Crow's claim that she was mere chattel. With Cal holding a lantern, she knelt on the frozen earth of the stable floor and pried open the crate. It was filled with the mundane effects of a lonely man-worn clothes. A few dog-eared books, mining tools. At the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small, leather-bound ledger. Her heart leaped. This was it. Proof! She carried it back to the cabin and opened it on the table under the lantern's glow. It was Abernathy's account book. She flipped through the pages, her fingers tracing the columns of meticulous entries. Axle grease, 15 cents. Flour, 1 sack, $1.10. Dynamite, 20 sticks, $4. And then she found it. A page near the back, dated 2 months before her departure from St. Louis. Her breath caught in her throat. It was an entry detailing a debt of $300 owed to a T.C. Enterprises. Beside it, Abernathy had made a chillingly clear notation. Debt to be settled upon delivery of E. Byrne. Passage and arrangement fee to be deducted from balance. The world tilted on its axis. The letters blurred before her eyes as the hideous truth crashed down upon her. It was all there, in Abernathy's own neat, detached script. She had never been a mail-order bride. There was no cabin waiting to be made a home. There had been no promise of a new life. She had been a commodity, a bargaining chip, a woman sold to settle a gambling debt or a crooked mining deal. Her passage west wasn't a ticket to a future. It was the final transaction in a sordid business deal. The shame she had felt before was nothing compared to this. This was a violation that scraped her soul raw, leaving her feeling utterly and irrevocably worthless. She closed the book, a wave of cold nausea rising in her throat. All her hopes had been built on a lie fabricated by two men who had seen her as nothing more than an item on a ledger. And now she had brought that lie, and the predators it attracted, to the door of the one person who had shown her a sliver of decency. She looked at Cal, who had been watching her, his face etched with concern. She couldn't speak. She simply pushed the open ledger across the table. He read the entry, and a muscle jumped in his jaw. The silence that followed was heavier than any stone. She knew then what she had to do. She could not let him fight this battle for her. She could not be the reason Tynan Crow brought his poison and his bought and paid for justice to this mountain. Later that night, long after Cal had retreated into the stoic silence that was his refuge, she made her decision. She waited until the rhythmic breathing from his corner of the cabin told her he was asleep, moving like a ghost. She packed a small bundle, a loaf of bread, a strip of dried meat, and the small sum of money she had sewn into the hem of her dress. She scribbled a hasty note, "I am sorry for the trouble. Do not follow," and left it on the table. Slipping on her coat and boots, she quietly lifted the bar on the door and stepped out into the crushing cold of the mountain night. A fresh layer of snow had fallen, and the moon cast a brilliant, sterile light over the landscape. Every crunch of her boots sounded like a gunshot in the profound silence. She would head south, she thought. She would lose herself in another territory, change her name. She would simply disappear. She had made it less than a mile down the trail when she heard the sound of a horse behind her. Her heart sank. She didn't turn around. She just stopped, her shoulders slumping in defeat. Cal rode up beside her. Not on the wagon horse, but on a lean, dark gelding from the stable. He wasn't angry. His face, in the moonlight, was a mask of grim resolve. He looked down at her, a small, solitary figure against the vast, indifferent wilderness. "This won't solve anything," he said, his voice quiet but carrying easily in the still air. "I won't be the reason you lose your home," she said, her voice choked with tears she refused to let fall. "I bring trouble. Can't you see that I am a debt to be collected? That's all I've ever been." "What you were to them is not what you are," he countered, dismounting in one smooth motion. He stood before her, blocking her path. Running is what Crow expects. He wants you scared. He wants you alone. "Then what choice do I have?" she cried, the words tearing from her throat. "To stay is to fight him, and that fight is yours as much as mine. I won't do that to you. I release you from our contract, from any obligation. You can tell the judge you sent me on my way." He reached out, not to touch her, but to block her view of the trail ahead, forcing her to look at him. His gray eyes were steady, intense. "I'm not asking you to stay for my sake," he said, his voice dropping lower, each word deliberate and weighted. "The contract doesn't matter. The trouble doesn't matter. There is only one thing that matters right now." He paused, letting the silence of the mountain press in around them. "Stay because you want to," he said, the emphasis entirely on her. "Not for me. Stay because you refuse to be a name in a dead man's ledger. Stay because this is your life, and you will not let a man like Tynan Crow write the last chapter. You make your stand here, On this mountain, because you choose to. The choice is yours." His words struck her with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't offering to save her. He wasn't offering protection out of pity or obligation. He was offering her back the one thing she thought she had lost forever, her own will. He was telling her that she was not a victim to be rescued, but a woman who could choose to fight. The cold air burned in her lungs. She looked past him, back up the trail toward the small, solitary cabin, its windows glowing with a faint, warm light. It wasn't a home, not yet, but it was a foothold. It was a place to make a stand. Slowly, deliberately, she nodded. He didn't smile, but the harsh lines of his face seemed to soften. He took the small bundle from her hands and tied it to his saddle, then turned and began the walk back up the trail, leading the horse. He left it to her to follow, and she did. She fell into step behind him, her boots crunching in the snow in time with his. They walked in silence, but it was a new kind of silence. The seeds of trust, planted in a moment of shared danger and watered with an offering of pure respect, had finally taken root. Part 4. The market, the trial, and the gaze. The decision to stay settled into a quiet, unwavering resolve. The night on the trail had burned away the last of Eliza's urge to flee. In its place was a core of hard, cold anger. She was not a line item in a ledger. She was a woman of flesh and blood, and she would not be erased. In the days leading up to the hearing, a change came over the homestead. It was no longer a place of hiding, but a headquarters for a quiet war. Cal spent his time reinforcing the stable doors and checking the sight lines from the cabin's windows, his actions speaking of a pragmatism that anticipated the law's failure. Eliza, meanwhile, waged her own campaign. She could not fight with an axe or a rifle, but she could fight with her hands and her wits. She would not walk into that hearing as the bride nobody wanted or as Calder Holt's charity case. She would walk in as Eliza Byrne, a woman of skill and substance. The town's first winter market was to be held 2 days before the hearing. It was her opportunity. She spent the intervening days in a flurry of focused activity, using the tallow from a deer Cal had brought down and the wood ash from the stove. She began the painstaking process of making lye soap. It was a harsh, smelly process, but one she knew from her childhood. She rendered the fat, leached the lye, and mixed the caustic blend with a steady hand, her thoughts as focused as the chemical reaction in the pot. By the end, she had 24 hard, pale bars of soap that smelled cleanly of pine, infused with needles she'd gathered herself. It was a tangible product of her labor, a small piece of civilization wrested from the wilderness. On the morning of the market, she dressed with care. Her clothes were simple, a mended brown wool skirt and a gray flannel shirtwaist, but they were immaculate. She braided her hair into a neat, severe coronet. It was the armor of respectability. When she presented Cal with a small bundle, he looked at her, confused. "My sewing kit," she explained. "I'll be mending for hire." He nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding in his gray eyes. This wasn't just about making a few coins. It was a public declaration of her identity. Prudence Gulch was bustling. Miners, trappers, and homesteading families crowded the muddy main street, their breath misting in the frigid air. They set up a small table near the entrance to the general store, a spot Cal had secured with a quiet word to the owner. Rosa Pike. Eliza laid out her bars of soap and a neat sign written on a piece of smoothed bark. Fine pine soap and expert mending. At first, people stared. The whispers followed her here, too. She was a curiosity, the woman at the center of the coming storm. She ignored them, keeping her eyes on her work as she began to repair a tear in one of Cal's old shirts, her needle moving with a swift, sure grace. Cal stood a few feet away, not hovering, but present, a silent, unmovable guardian. Her first customer was Rosa Pike, the store owner. A stout woman with intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor marched right up to the table. "Heard you were setting up shop. Dear," she said, her voice loud enough for those nearby to hear, "best soap in the territory is made with pine and elbow grease. I'll take 4 bars." She paid in coin and held up a bar for others to see. A woman who can make something of use is a damn sight better than a man who only knows how to cause trouble. Her sharp glance in the direction of the saloon left no doubt as to whom she was referring. Rosa's endorsement broke the ice. A few other women, emboldened, came forward. A farmer's wife bought 2 bars of soap. A young miner shyly asked if she could patch the knee of his canvas trousers, paying her with a grateful smile. With each transaction, each quiet conversation, Eliza felt her confidence grow. She was not just an object of gossip. She was a part of the town's commerce. A woman with a trade. The fragile peace was shattered around midday. Tynan Crow and 2 of his hired thugs appeared, parting the crowd like a ship's prow through water. They stopped directly in front of her table, casting a long shadow over her work. Playing shopkeeper Crow sneered, his eyes raking over her with possessive insolence. "You should be saving your hands for the work you'll be doing at my establishment. Pack this nonsense up. You're coming with me." He reached out to grab her arm. Before his fingers could touch her sleeve, Cal moved. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply stepped between them. A silent, physical barrier. The good-natured noise of the market died. Everyone was watching. "The hearing you arranged is on Friday." "Crow," Cal said, his voice low and even, yet it carried with absolute clarity. "Judge Pike will make his decision then. Until that time, Miss Byrne is a free citizen, and you will not lay a hand on her." "She is my property. I have a bill of sale," Crow blustered, his face reddening. "And I have a signed labor contract that predates your claim," Cal countered, his voice like chipping ice. "We will present both to the judge. That is how the law works. But if you touch her now, you will be the one explaining the crime of assault to a federal marshal, and I will be the one to make the complaint." Crow was momentarily stunned into silence. He had expected a brawl, a show of force he was prepared to win with his 2 men. He was not prepared for this cold, logical recitation of the law. He looked around at the faces in the crowd, saw the disapproval in Rosa Pike's eyes, the uncertainty in others. To force the issue here would make him look like a bully, not a businessman. He spat on the ground near Cal's feet. "Enjoy your last day of freedom." He snarled at Eliza. "On Friday, the law will give me what is mine." He turned and stalked away, his men following in his wake. The day of the hearing. The saloon in Prudence Gulch was cleared of its tables and chairs to serve as a makeshift courtroom. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, sawdust, and nervous sweat. The room was packed. The townspeople divided into 2 clear factions. On one side stood Crow, his men, and a handful of miners and businessmen who saw the world in terms of contracts and property. On the other side stood Rosa Pike, the young miner whose trousers Eliza had mended, and a few other homesteading families who understood the vulnerability of a life on the frontier. Judge Wallace Pike, a portly man with a florid face and small, shrewd eyes, presided from a riser at the front of the room. He was Rosa's brother, but he shared none of her integrity. He banged a gavel, and the proceedings began. It was a farce from the start. Crow's lawyer presented the bill of sale from Abernathy. Judge Pike examined it with a solemn nod, declaring it to be in order. When Cal presented their own labor contract, the judge dismissed it. "This document is irrelevant," he declared, waving it away. "Mr. Crow's claim is based on a prior financial instrument. A debt was owed, and this woman was the collateral. The debt is now Mr. Crow's, and so is the collateral. The man who signed that bill of sale is dead." "Your Honor," Cal stated, his voice ringing with cold reason, "the contract is void." "Nonsense," the judge boomed. "A debt outlives the man. It is the foundation of commerce." Eliza sat beside Cal, her hands clenched in her lap. She felt the net drawing tight. The law, which was supposed to be a shield, was being used as a club to beat her into submission. Whispers rippled through the room. "He's right. A deal is a deal." The bride nobody wanted. Now she's the bride nobody can get rid of. Judge Pike was about to deliver his verdict. He puffed out his chest, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. "In the matter of this contractual dispute, I find that the claim of Mr. Tynan Crow is valid. Custody of Miss Eliza Byrne is to be transferred to him for the settlement of— I believe you'll find that claim has a fatal flaw, Your Honor." The voice came from the back of the room. A tall, gaunt man in the simple black coat of a clergyman stepped forward. It was Reverend Albright, a circuit preacher known for his sharp mind and his even sharper sense of justice. He held up a worn leather book. The judge scowled. "Reverend, this is a court of law, not a church." "Indeed," Albright replied, his calm voice cutting through the tension. "And the law of this territory is quite clear. A contract for personal service, which is a generous interpretation of this sordid document, is rendered null and void by the death of either signatory. Mr. Abernathy's death dissolved his claim. He could not sell what he no longer legally possessed." He opened the ledger, Abernathy's ledger, which Cal and Eliza had given him the night before. "Furthermore," the Reverend continued, his voice rising, "this was never a legitimate contract. It was a trade in human flesh to settle a debt. I have here Mr. Abernathy's own accounts, which state clearly that Miss Byrne's passage was considered settlement on a debt to an entity owned by Mr. Crow himself. This is not commerce. Your Honor, this is a conspiracy to deprive a woman of her liberty." He read the entry aloud. The room fell into a stunned silence, broken by gasps and angry mutters. He had laid the entire sordid scheme bare for the whole town to see. Eliza was not a jilted bride. She was the victim of a calculated plot. The mood in the room shifted. The women looked at Eliza with open sympathy. Even some of the miners, men who lived by hard bargains, looked at Crow with disgust. Judge Pike's face went from red to purple. He was cornered. To rule for Crow now would be to admit his own corruption in front of the entire town and a man of God. But to rule against him would be to cross a powerful and vindictive man. He banged his gavel furiously. "Unsubstantiated irregular, this court requires time to review these allegations," he sputtered. "This hearing is postponed indefinitely." He scrambled down from his riser and fled through a back door. They had won. For now. As the crowd began to disperse, Cal and Eliza made their way outside into the cold, clean air. But their relief was short-lived. Crow was waiting for them, his face a mask of pure hatred. "You think you're clever?" "Halt!" he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "You and your preacher. But there's more than one kind of law in this territory. And there's more than one way to collect on a debt. I will have what I am owed." He gave Eliza one last, lingering look of chilling promise before turning and disappearing into the crowd. As she and Cal rode the wagon back toward the mountain, Eliza looked out at the vast, unforgiving landscape. She had survived the hearing. She had faced down her accuser, but she felt no sense of triumph. She understood now, with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating. The law was just a set of rules, and rules could be bent or broken. A judge could be bought, and a contract could be a cage. True safety did not lie in a piece of paper or in a courtroom. It lay in her own strength, in the steadfast presence of the man beside her, and in the alliances she had just begun to forge. If she was going to survive in this wild country, she would have to be as strong and unyielding as the mountains themselves. The fight was far from over. It had only just begun. Part 5. The hearth and the request, not the command. The victory in Prudence Gulch was a fragile thing, a temporary stay against a tit of malice. Tynan Crow's threat lingered in the air, a poison that tainted the clear mountain winter. In the weeks that followed the hearing, A new kind of tension settled over the homestead on Bear's spine. It was the watchfulness of soldiers in a quiet trench. Every snap of a twig in the woods, every shadow that moved at dusk, was a potential threat. Cal took to carrying his rifle whenever he worked the timberline, and Eliza found herself scanning the trail below the cabin with a frequency that frayed her nerves. They were bound together now, not by a contract of labor, but by a shared enemy. This mutual danger forged a new intimacy between them, one born of vigilance and reliance. They spoke more, their conversations no longer limited to the practical necessities of the day. He told her stories of the war, not of battles, but of the crushing boredom and the bone-deep cold. She, in turn, spoke of St. Louis, of the scent of different fabrics in her family's shop, of the quiet pride in a perfectly executed seam. They were filling in the empty spaces of each other's lives, sketching in the histories that had made them who they were. Amidst this, Eliza noticed a new project taking shape in the cabin. In the evenings, after the chores were done, Cal would often work by the firelight with a block of seasoned pine and a set of carving tools. He worked slowly with an absorbed patience, shavings falling to the floor in fragrant curls. He was not building anything practical like a chair or a shelf. The pieces were curved, delicate, rockers, spindles. He was making a cradle. He never spoke of it, and she never asked. It sat in the corner, a silent testament to a hope he seemed unwilling to voice, a dream he was whittling into shape with his own two hands. Its presence was a question mark in the small room, a symbol of a future that felt both impossible and achingly desired. The weather, as if mirroring the turmoil of their lives, turned violent. A Chinook wind, unseasonably warm and unsettling, melted the top layer of snow, only to be followed by a plunge in temperature that turned the world to a sheet of ice. And then, the storm hit. It was a blizzard of biblical fury, a howling, white-toothed monster that threw itself against the small cabin. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and the snow came down not in flakes, but in a solid, blinding curtain. They spent the first day and night inside, the cabin a small arc of warmth in a sea of frozen chaos. On the second night, the assault intensified. A gust of wind hit the roof with the force of a battering ram, and a deep, groaning crack echoed through the room. A fine dusting of snow sifted down from the rafters. Cal was on his feet in an instant, lantern held high. His face was stark in the flickering light. A main support beam. It splintered. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced Eliza. If the roof went, they would be buried. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. "We brace it," he said, his voice a calm command in the heart of the storm. "There's a spare timber in the stable. We have to wedge it alongside, transfer the load." The journey to the stable, a distance of no more than 30 yards, was a nightmare. They tied a rope between the cabin and the stable door, a lifeline in the blinding whiteout. The wind tore at them, stealing their breath and trying to rip them from their feet. They found the timber, a massive, heavy length of pine, and began the Herculean task of dragging it back to the cabin. They worked as one, shouting encouragement to each other over the roar of the wind, their bodies straining, their hands raw from the cold and the rough wood. Inside, the groan from the ceiling was louder, more insistent. Working by the light of 2 lanterns, they maneuvered the heavy timber into position. Cal climbed the ladder to the loft, his axe in hand, to clear away the ceiling boards around the damaged beam. Eliza stood below, passing him tools, her eyes fixed on the splintered wood, praying it would hold. The final step was the most dangerous. They had to lift the new beam into place and hammer wedges between it and the damaged one, forcing it to take the roof's immense weight. "I'll lift," Cal said, his muscles cording in his back and shoulders as he positioned himself beneath the timber. "You hammer the wedges. Hit them hard and fast. Once I start to lift, I can't hold it for long." Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. The fate of their shelter rested in her hands. She gripped the heavy mallet, its weight familiar and reassuring. She had driven stakes and pegs before, but never with so much on the line. "Ready?" Cal grunted, his face a mask of concentration as he began to straighten, the muscles in his legs and back bunching as he took the strain. The timber rose, inch by agonizing inch. Now he roared over the storm. Eliza swung. The mallet struck the first wedge with a solid thwack. She didn't hesitate, striking again and again, her movements a blur of controlled power. She drove one wedge in, then another, the sound of the blows a frantic, desperate drumbeat against the storm's symphony. She could hear Cal's ragged breathing, could see the sweat beading on his brow despite the cold, just as she felt her arms begin to burn with fatigue. She saw the new beam settle firmly into place, snug against the rafters. The groaning stopped. Cal eased his weight off, his chest heaving. Silence descended inside the cabin, a pocket of stillness surrounded by the raging storm. They had done it. They had saved their shelter. For a long moment, they just stood there, breathing heavily, covered in sawdust and sweat. He looked down at her from the ladder, and his eyes, in the lantern light, held a new depth of respect, a raw admiration that went beyond anything she had seen before. She looked back, her own gaze steady. In that shared moment of exhaustion and triumph, the last of the walls between them crumbled into dust. Slowly, he descended the ladder. They moved to the cast-iron stove, the center of their small world, and collapsed into their chairs. The fire in the stove crackled and hissed, a warm and living thing. Outside, the storm still howled its fury, but it could no longer touch them. They were safe. They sat in a comfortable silence, the silence of two people who have faced a mortal threat together and emerged victorious. The firelight played across Cal's face, softening the harsh lines, making the scar on his forehead seem less a wound and more a part of his history. It glinted off the calluses on his hands, hands that could fell a tree, build a house, and, she now knew, hold up a roof. He finally broke the silence, his voice low and raspy. "I've been alone a long time," he said, not looking at her, but staring into the flames. "Came up here after the mines. The silence was what I wanted. A man can get used to silence, gets to where he prefers it." He paused, and she waited, knowing this was a confession of sorts, a peeling back of layers he had kept intact for years. "But the last few weeks, hearing your footsteps on the floorboards in the morning, the smell of bread baking, it's a different kind of quiet now. It's not empty anymore." He finally turned his head and looked at her, his gray eyes searching her face. "This place, it feels more like a home than it ever has." His gaze drifted to the corner, to the unfinished cradle. "I started that a year ago. Felt like a fool, a lonely man building a cradle for a ghost, for a dream of a son to carry on a name that nobody would miss if it was gone." He took a deep, shuddering breath, and the vulnerability in that sound pierced her heart. He was showing her the deepest, most secret chambers of his soul. He was admitting his loneliness, his yearning. He was not the stoic, self-sufficient mountain man he appeared to be. He was a man who longed for a family. He looked back at her, his eyes dark with an emotion she couldn't name. It was a mixture of hope and fear, a question he seemed terrified to ask. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, a humble, tentative sound that was profoundly at odds with the powerful man who had just held up a roof. "Will you give me sons?" The words hung in the warm air between them, ancient and profound. It was the question every man of his time asked of a woman, the fundamental purpose of a union. It was the question that had haunted Eliza, the question she believed she could never answer. A cold dread began to seep into her bones. But then, before the silence could curdle, he broke it himself, his expression changing as if he'd realized the weight, the demand, in what he had just asked. He shook his head slightly. His eyes filled with a sudden, fierce earnestness. "No," he said, correcting himself, his voice gaining a new intensity. "That's not right. That's not what I mean to ask." He leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. "Or sons, daughters, or none at all. If it's not meant to be, the cradle can stay empty. That's not the point." He looked directly into her eyes, and she saw no demand there, only a raw, heartfelt plea. "What I'm asking is, would you want to try with me and raise any child that comes to this house by blood or by heart?" The distinction was everything. It was the difference between a command and a partnership. He was not asking for an heir. He was not demanding she fulfill a biological function. He was asking if she would share a life with him, a life that might or might not include children. And by adding, or by heart, he was telling her that a family, in his eyes, was not defined solely by blood. It was defined by love and commitment. For the first time since leaving St. Louis, she felt the branding iron of the doctor's words cool on her soul. She could finally speak her own truth, confess her own deepest wound. "When I was in St. Louis," she began, her voice quiet but clear, "after the fever, there was someone, a young man from a good family. We were to be married." She stared into the fire, the memories painful and sharp. "I became pregnant. I was so happy. And then, one day, there was pain and blood, and it was gone. It was over before it had ever truly begun." She took a breath, the telling of it still agony. "The doctor who tended to me was the same one who had treated me for the fever. He told my mother it was for the best. He said the fever had left me damaged, unfit for childbearing, that any future attempts would likely end the same way." The whispers started then. The young man's family broke the engagement. I was spoiled goods, a woman who could not fulfill her purpose. She finally looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You are the first person who has ever made me feel that my worth is not measured by what my body can or cannot produce. You asked me to stay because I wanted to, and now you are asking me to build a life, not just to bear a son." A single tear traced a path down her cheek, and she did not wipe it away. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Cal, I want to try." A profound relief washed over his face, so deep it seemed to take years of hardship with it. He didn't move to touch her, didn't try to kiss her. The moment was too sacred for that. It was a vow, a promise exchanged in the heart of a storm. After a long while, he stood and wordlessly held out his hand. She placed her hand in his, and he led her not to the bed, but to the corner of the room where the unfinished cradle stood, in the warm, flickering firelight. He placed his large, calloused hand on the smooth, curved wood of the rocker. Hesitantly, she placed her hand beside his. Their fingers brushed, sending a jolt of warmth and connection through her that had nothing to do with passion and everything to do with hope. "If it stays empty," she said softly, giving voice to the promise his question had offered, "it will still be a cradle of hope." "Our cradle," he affirmed, his voice thick with emotion. Outside, the blizzard raged on, trying to tear their world apart. But inside the small cabin on Bear's Spine, two lonely, damaged people had found a quiet center. They had built a fortress not just of logs and stone, but of trust and acceptance. And in its hearth, they had kindled a fire that no storm could ever extinguish. Part 6. Blood on the Snow and the Law of the Community. The storm passed, leaving the world scoured and pristine. In its wake, a profound quiet settled over Bear's Spine, a silence that felt less like emptiness and more like peace. The vow made in the heart of the blizzard had changed everything. The cabin was no longer a temporary shelter, but the foundation of a shared future. Cal and Eliza moved with a new synchronicity. The unspoken spaces between them filled with a tender, unspoken understanding. He would watch her hands as she kneaded dough, a small, wondering smile touching his lips. She would listen for the sound of his axe in the distance, a steady rhythm that spoke of safety and presence. He had finished the cradle. It sat by the hearth, its pine rockers smooth as polished river stones. It was a promise given form, a constant, gentle reminder of the life they had chosen to build together. Come what may. They were happy. It was a simple, fragile happiness. And in the harshness of that land, they both knew such things were rarely allowed to last. The attack came on a night of crystalline cold, when a full moon hung in an ink-black sky, casting the snow-covered landscape in stark relief of silver and shadow. There was no warning, just a sudden, panicked bleating from the sheep, followed by a sound that would forever be etched in Eliza's memory, the hungry, whooshing roar of fire. Cal was awake before the sound had even fully registered, the Winchester already in his hands. He kicked open the cabin door, and the scene that met them was a vision of hell. The stable, their small, sturdy bastion of security, was engulfed in flames. Orange and yellow tongues of fire licked at the night sky, devouring the dry pine logs and sending a column of thick, black smoke billowing into the clean, cold air. Framed against the inferno were three figures on horseback, the man in the center, his face a demonic mask in the firelight, was Tynan Crow. Holt Crow's voice was a triumphant roar, carrying easily across the snow. "I told you I'd collect what's owed. You can't hide behind a preacher's words up here. Come out and face your debt." It was a trap, plain and simple. He wanted to draw Cal out into the open, but Cal's first thought, his only thought, was for her. Eliza. Stay back, bar the door. But Eliza wasn't looking at Crow. Her eyes were fixed on the stable. The horses had already kicked their way out, their eyes wild with terror as they galloped into the darkness of the trees. But the sheep, penned in their shed adjacent to the main structure, were trapped, their terrified cries slicing through the roar of the flames. They were the start of the flock she and Cal had planned, the source of the wool for the blankets she would weave, the living, breathing symbol of their future. "The sheep," she gasped, her mind racing. The main stable wall was on fire, but the shed, on the far side, was not yet fully engulfed. There was a gate at the back. "Eliza!" No, Cal's voice was sharp, a command. But she was already moving. She was not the same woman who had arrived at Dry Creek Station, a victim of circumstance. She was a woman of this mountain now, a partner, a defender of her home. She grabbed a heavy wool blanket from the bed, plunged it into the water barrel by the door until it was soaked and heavy, and ran. She didn't run toward Crow. She circled wide, using the cabin as cover, her feet sinking into the deep snow as she scrambled toward the back of the burning structure. The heat was a physical blow, and the smoke was a choking, acrid beast that clawed at her throat and made her eyes stream. She wrapped the wet blanket over her head and shoulders and fumbled with the wooden latch on the sheep pen's gate. It was swollen with ice and heat, refusing to budge, with a cry of desperate frustration. She threw her shoulder against it. Once, twice, on the third try, the wood splintered, and the gate flew open. The three sheep, bleating in terror, bolted out into the snow, scattering into the night. Relief washed over her. But it was short-lived. A wave of black smoke, thick and oily, billowed from the collapsing roof. It enveloped her, stealing the air from her lungs, blinding her. She coughed, a deep, racking sound, and stumbled back. The world dissolved into a swirling vortex of smoke, fire, and suffocating darkness. Disoriented, she turned not toward the cabin, but away from the heat, staggering into the disorienting moon shadows of the pine forest. From the cabin doorway, Cal watched in horror as she disappeared into the smoke. He roared her name, a sound of pure, primal anguish. For a single, frozen moment, he was torn between the threat in front of him and the woman lost in the chaos. The choice was no choice at all. Crow and his games of property and pride meant nothing. Eliza was everything. He fired one shot from the Winchester, not at Crow, but into the air above his head. A single, sharp crack of defiance. Then, without a second glance at the men who had brought this ruin upon him, he plunged into the smoke-filled night, his only thought to find her. Eliza. He followed her tracks in the snow. A frantic, desperate search. The smoke was everywhere, a confusing, blinding fog that twisted the familiar landscape into a nightmare. He found her collapsed at the edge of the tree line, a small, still heap in the snow. 100 yards from the cabin, she was trying to push herself up, coughing weakly, her face pale in the moonlight. He fell to his knees beside her, his hands running over her, checking for burns, for injuries. "Are you hurt, Eliza? Talk to me." "The smoke," she gasped, her voice a raw whisper. "I couldn't breathe." He lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing, his relief so profound it was painful. He started back toward the cabin, his mind already working. He had to get her inside, get her away from the cold and the smoke. But as he emerged from the trees, he saw that Crow and one of his men had dismounted. They were advancing on the cabin, intent on finishing what they had started. "Nowhere left to run. Halt!" Crow called out, a pistol gleaming in his hand. Cal gently set Eliza down behind the relative safety of the woodpile. "Stay here," he whispered, his voice shaking with a fury he had not felt since the war. He laid his rifle on the snow, knowing a long gun was useless at close quarters. He drew the heavy skinning knife from his belt. This would be settled now, in the old way, man to man. He walked forward to meet them, a silent, deadly figure moving through the snow. The lone rider who had stayed on his horse seemed to lose his nerve. Turning and galloping back down the trail toward town, it was just Crow and his one remaining thug. The fight was brutal and swift. It was not a duel of honor, but a desperate, ugly brawl in the snow and firelight. Cal moved with a lethal economy born of countless saloon and battlefield fights, disabling the hired thug with a series of precise, debilitating blows before turning his full attention to Crow. They circled each other, two predators in a blood-red arena. Crow fired his pistol, the shot wild, searing the air past Cal's head before he could fire again. Cal lunged, grabbing the gun hand and twisting. The pistol flew into a snowdrift as Cal's knife flashed. He wasn't aiming to kill, but to end the fight. The blade sliced across Crow's arm, and the man screamed, a sound of rage and pain. They fell to the ground, grappling in the snow, a chaotic explosion of fists and curses. Eliza watched, her head clearing in the frigid air. She saw Crow, momentarily on top, reach for a rock. She saw the murderous intent in his eyes. Her mind, sharpened by adrenaline, was suddenly crystal clear. She would not be a spectator in this fight for her own life. Scrambling to her feet, she ran into the cabin, past the cradle, and grabbed the old flintlock pistol that hung on the wall, a relic from Cal's father. Kept more for sentiment than use, but it was loaded. She ran back out, her hands shaking as she cocked the heavy hammer. She was not a marksman. In the chaos, she could easily hit Cal, so she aimed high, at the black, star-filled sky, and pulled the trigger. The flintlock exploded with a deafening boom and a great cloud of white smoke, a sound far louder and more shocking than Crow's modern pistol. The effect was instantaneous. Crow's horse, already spooked by the fire, reared with a scream of terror. It thrashed wildly, its hooves lashing out before bolting into the darkness. But in its panic, it had stumbled sideways, crashing into Crow, who was just getting to his feet. There was a sickening crunch of bone. Crow collapsed, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle beneath him. He lay on the ground, groaning. The fight knocked out of him, but his eyes, full of venom, found the discarded pistol in the snowdrift. With his good arm, he began to crawl toward it. It was then that they heard the thunder of approaching horses. the shouts of many men. A posse. Bursting from the trail into the clearing came a dozen riders, but they were not Crow's men. At the lead was Samuel, the blacksmith, a shotgun held across his saddle. Beside him rode Reverend Albright, and just behind them was Rosa Pike, her face a grim mask of determination, along with a score of other homesteaders and miners from Prudence Gulch. They took in the scene in a single glance: the burning stable, the two men on the ground, and Eliza, standing like a wraith with a smoking pistol in her hand. "It's over! Crow!" Samuel boomed, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command. He dismounted, along with several others, and secured Crow, confiscating the pistol he had been crawling toward. Judge Pike was with them, his face pale and sweating, clearly dragged along against his will. Reverend Albright strode to the center of the clearing. "We saw the fire from the valley," he announced, his voice ringing with righteous anger. "We've had enough of your brand of law, Tynan Crow, and yours, Judge." He turned his piercing gaze on the cowering official. "The citizens of this community have formed a council. We are relieving you of your duties until a federal marshal can be summoned. Your justice is at an end." As if on cue, one of the riders who had come with the posse, the same man who had fled the fight moments before, slid from his horse, his hands raised. "I'll talk," he stammered, looking at Crow with terror. "I ain't hanging for this. He made me do it. It wasn't just her. There were others, girls from back east. He'd pay their passage, then sell their contracts to the saloons and the mining camps. Abernathy was just one of his brokers." The full, ugly truth was finally out, laid bare in the flickering light of the dying fire. It wasn't just a personal vendetta. It was a criminal enterprise. The whispers in the crowd turned to a low, angry growl. Crow was no longer a disputed businessman. He was a trafficker, a predator who had used the hopes of desperate women to line his own pockets. Samuel, the blacksmith, produced a set of irons and clamped them on Crow's wrists. The man who had terrorized them for months was finally brought low, not by a single man's vengeance, but by the collective will of a community that had decided to stand for something better. The immediate danger was over. The adrenaline that had sustained Eliza finally drained away, and the full effect of the smoke she had inhaled hit her. The world began to spin, the faces of the townsfolk blurring into a swirling kaleidoscope. Her lungs felt like they were on fire. A black curtain descended, and she knew no more. She collapsed into the snow. Eliza Cal's cry was one of pure terror. He pushed through the crowd and fell to his knees beside her, gathering her limp form into his arms. He brushed the hair from her face, his hands trembling. He looked down at her still, pale face, and in that moment, the entire world narrowed to a single, terrifying point. His ghosts, the war, the mine, the years of self-imposed solitude, they all vanished. They were nothing. His greatest fear had never been the darkness of a collapsed tunnel or the memory of a dead friend. It had been an abstract fear of loss, of attachment. But this was real. The thought of losing her, of the silence returning to the cabin not as peace, but as a permanent, aching void that was a fear so profound it threatened to unmake him. The lone wolf of Bear's Spine was gone forever. In his place was a man who had just found his entire world, only to have it threatened with being snatched away. He held her tight, as if he could anchor her to life with the sheer force of his will, and for the first time in years. Calder Holt prayed. Part 7. The Thaw. Eliza woke to the smell of lavender and clean linen, a scent so out of place it felt like a dream. The ceiling above her was not made of rough-hewn pine logs, but of smooth, whitewashed planks. She was not in the cabin. She was lying in a soft bed, the likes of which she hadn't felt since St. Louis. A thick quilt pulled up to her chin. Panic, cold and immediate, seized her. She sat up, a coughing fit racking her small frame, her lungs feeling raw and bruised. "Easy now. Easy, child." A firm, gentle hand pressed her back against the pillows. It was Rosa Pike. The store owner's face, usually set in a mask of shrewd competence, was soft with concern. Cal Eliza's voice was a hoarse croak. "Where is Cal?" "Right where he's been for the past 2 days," Rosa said, nodding toward a chair in the corner of the room. "Refused to leave your side. Hasn't slept more than a blink. Scared the life out of us all. You did." Cal was asleep in the chair, his large frame slumped in exhaustion. His face was smudged with soot and etched with worry, even in slumber. His rifle leaned against the wall beside him, a testament to the fact that even here, in the safety of Rosa's spare room above the general store, he had not relaxed his vigil. Seeing him there, a wave of profound love and gratitude washed over her, so powerful it left her breathless. He was her anchor, her harbor. She spent 2 more days in that room, recovering from the smoke that had seared her lungs. The town doctor, a gruff but thorough man named Elias Finch, pronounced that she would suffer no lasting harm, but that she needed rest. During that time, a steady stream of visitors came to the general store, not for her, but for Cal. They brought news, offers of help, and a quiet, determined sense of community she had never expected to find. Samuel the blacksmith came first. "We've got Crow and his man locked in the ice house until the marshal gets here from Boise," he reported, his voice a low rumble. "As for Judge Pike, our Citizens' Council has strongly suggested he take an extended holiday." He agreed. He then looked at Cal, his gaze direct. "The stable's a total loss. Halt, but the cabin's sound. When you're ready, the town will help you rebuild. My boys and I can have the main timbers cut and notched in a week." Other homesteaders followed. They brought offers of lumber, of saved nails, of a day's labor. The women, led by Rosa, organized meals, their quiet, efficient compassion, a powerful force against the chaos that Crow had unleashed. Eliza, listening from her sickbed, was humbled. These people, who had once whispered about her, who had looked at her with suspicion and pity, were now rallying to her and Cal's side. They were no longer outsiders. The fire had forged them into a part of the community's heart. When she was finally strong enough to make the journey, Cal took her home. The sight of the homestead was a shock. The cabin stood, scarred but defiant, against the backdrop of the mountain. But where the stable had been, there was only a blackened, rectangular hole in the snow, a charred tombstone marking the violence of that night. The air still held the faint, sickeningly sweet smell of burnt pine. But they were not alone in their cleanup. As promised, the men from Prudence Gulch arrived. A work party, a barn raising in reverse. Under Samuel's expert direction, they cleared the debris, laid a new foundation, and began to raise the walls of a new stable, stronger and better than the first. Cal worked alongside them, his silence one of deep, abiding gratitude. He was not a man who found words easily, but his actions, the way he shared his coffee, the respectful nod he gave each man at the end of the day spoke volumes. Eliza, forbidden from heavy labor, found her own way to contribute. She set up a long trestle table outside the cabin and became the camp cook, keeping a huge pot of stew simmering over an open fire and a seemingly endless supply of coffee hot. She mended torn shirts, patched worn trousers, and sharpened tools on Cal's whetstone. As she worked, she felt the last of the shame from her past fall away. She was not a burden. She was a partner, a vital part of this shared life. Her skills as necessary and as valued as a man's strength with an axe. It was during this time that an idea took root. She watched the men working in the biting wind, their coats thin and inadequate against the mountain's chill. Using a bolt of heavy canvas she'd had Rosa order for her and the fleece from the 3 sheep she had saved who had been found, unharmed, by a neighboring homesteader, she began to design something new. A coat lined with wool, with a high collar, reinforced seams, and deep pockets. A garment made not for city streets, but for the unforgiving reality of a mountain winter. It was a piece of practical art, and when she presented the first one to Samuel as a gift of thanks, he was stunned by its quality. "My dear girl," he'd boomed, shrugging on the heavy coat, "you could sell 100 of these. Every man in the territory would want one." And so, a new enterprise was born. Eliza Burns Mountain Outfitters, operating for now from a corner of her own cabin. As the new stable rose, so did their spirits. Winter's icy grip began to loosen. The days grew longer, and the snow began to recede from the south-facing slopes. The thaw had begun, both outside and in. It was in the midst of this quiet, industrious peace that Eliza realized her monthly courses had not come. At first, she dismissed it. The shock, the smoke, the upheaval, it was enough to disrupt any woman's cycle. But as another week passed, a small, terrifying, and wondrous hope began to flutter in her heart, delicate as a butterfly's wing. She said nothing to Cal. The possibility was too fragile, her history too fraught with disappointment. To give voice to the hope felt like tempting fate. But Cal saw the change in her. He saw the new stillness about her, the way her hand would sometimes go to her belly in an unconscious, protective gesture. He saw the mixture of fear and wonder in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. He said nothing either, but he began to do all the heavy lifting, bringing the water buckets in himself, insisting she sit by the fire in the evenings. His quiet care was a language all its own. The hope was allowed to grow for 3 more weeks. And then, one evening, as she was rising from her chair, it happened. A sudden, sharp, twisting cramp low in her belly that stole her breath and sent a jolt of pure, ice-cold terror through her. She cried out, her hand flying to the spot, her face draining of all color. The memory of St. Louis, of the blood and the loss, came crashing back with the force of a physical blow. "No," she whispered, the word a desperate prayer. "Oh, God, no!" Cal was at her side in an instant, his face a mask of fear. He saw the look in her eyes and understood immediately. He lifted her as gently as if she were made of spun glass and carried her to the bed, his mind racing. Prudence Gulch was half a day's ride away, the trail still treacherous with mud and melting snow. Dr. Finch was gone, moved on to the next mining camp. They were alone. He sat by the bed, holding her hand, his own helplessness a torment. The cramp subsided, but was followed by a dull, persistent ache. They spent the night in a state of suspended terror, waiting for the worst, praying for a miracle. Eliza lay perfectly still, tears leaking from the corners of her eyes, mourning a loss that felt both fresh and terribly familiar. Cal did not leave her side, his presence a solid, unwavering warmth in the cold darkness of her fear. The miracle arrived the next afternoon in the form of a wiry man on a mule. He was a traveling physician, a former Army surgeon named Dr. Abraham Cole, who made his living tending to the scattered, isolated homesteads of the territory. He had heard of their trouble at Dry Creek Station and had made the trip up to check on them. His examination of Eliza was gentle and professional. He listened to her story, his face impassive. When he was done, he sat back, his expression serious. Cal and Eliza held their breath. "You've had a scare, Doctor," Cole said, his voice calm and reassuring. "A bad one. It's what we call a threatened loss. The child is still holding on, but precariously. The next few months are critical." He looked directly at Eliza, his gaze stern. "You are to remain in bed. No lifting, no strenuous work, no long periods on your feet. Complete rest. It is the only chance you have." The relief that flooded the room was so immense it was almost dizzying. It was not a promise, but it was a chance. Hope, which had been all but extinguished, flickered back to life. Cal wrung the doctor's hand, his voice thick with an emotion that left him unable to form words. And so began the long wait, Eliza became a willing prisoner in the bed, her world shrinking to the four walls of the cabin. Cal became her tireless nurse, her cook, her protector. He tended the fire, cooked the meals, and brought her wildflowers he found in the first snow-free patches of the meadow. He would sit for hours by her bed, reading to her from his small collection of books, or simply telling her about his day, his voice a low, soothing murmur. In this period of enforced stillness, their bond deepened into something unbreakable. He was caring not just for her, but for the fragile, nascent life she carried. Spring finally arrived in a rush of green. The creek thawed and roared its freedom. The aspens put out new, trembling leaves, and the air grew soft and filled with the scent of damp earth and new life. And inside the cabin, life was growing too. The danger passed. The ache subsided. Eliza's belly began to swell, a gentle, wondrous curve. One clear, bright morning in late May, her labor began. It was long and difficult, but Cal was with her every moment, his hand a steady anchor, his voice a constant encouragement. He followed the instructions the doctor had left, his fear warring with a fierce, protective determination. And then, as the afternoon sun streamed through the cabin window, a new sound filled the small room, a sound that was at once shocking and miraculous, the thin, lusty cry of a newborn baby. He wrapped the child, a girl, in a soft flannel blanket and placed her in Eliza's arms. She was so small, so perfect, her face red and wrinkled, her tiny fists waving in the air. Eliza looked down at her daughter, and a love so fierce and overwhelming filled her that it eclipsed all the pain, all the fear, all the years of sorrow. She looked up at Cal, who was watching them, his face streaked with tears. Later that evening, the cabin was quiet. The baby slept in the pine cradle by the hearth, the firelight dancing on its smooth, pale wood. Cal and Eliza sat side by side on the edge of the bed, watching her. The road ahead would be hard. Raising a child in this wilderness would be a constant struggle. There were no guarantees, no easy promises. But the door to a future they had barely dared to dream of had been thrown wide open. They decided to name her Grace, for the grace of God that had brought them through the fire and the storm, and for the grace they had found in each other's arms. Eliza reached out and placed her hand on the cradle, her fingers resting next to Cal's. "Whether the cradle was empty or full," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion, her words a renewal of their vow. "This house is still a home." Cal looked from his daughter's sleeping face to his wife's tired, radiant one. The silence he had once cultivated as a shield had been vanquished forever by the most beautiful sound he had ever known. "The sound of a person in the house," he said, his own voice a rough whisper. "My old dream." Part 2. The badge by the hearth and the horizon. The first summer of Grace's life was a season of quiet miracles. The mountain, which had once been a symbol of isolation and survival, transformed into a place of deep, nurturing peace. The air was soft, filled with the drone of bees and the scent of wild roses that grew in defiant clusters among the rocks. The homestead on Bear's Spine, once a solitary outpost, was now a home, its rhythms dictated by the needs of a newborn and the steady, shared work of two people building a life. The new stable stood strong and proud, its fresh-cut pine smelling sharp and clean in the sun. It was more than a building. It was a monument to the community's goodwill. Every log and peg a testament to the day the people of Prudence Gulch decided that decency was a law worth defending. Justice, it turned out, was a slow but steady force. A month after the fire, a U.S.S. Marshal named Elias Vance rode into the territory. He was a tall, quiet man with eyes that had seen too much and a jaw that looked as though it had been carved from granite. He spent a week in Prudence Gulch, taking statements, examining Abernathy's ledger, and listening to the quiet, damning testimony of the Citizens' Council. Tynan Crow and his remaining associate were taken in chains to Boise for a federal trial, their reign of predatory commerce brought to an unceremonious end. Before he left, Marshal Vance made the ride up to Bear's Spine. He sat at their table, sipping Eliza's strong coffee, his gaze taking in the small, orderly cabin, the neatly stacked firewood, and the pine cradle rocking gently by the hearth. He listened to Cal's terse, factual account of the fire and the fight, and to Eliza's clearer, more detailed story of the contract and the deception. When they were finished, he was silent for a long time, staring at the empty tin cup in his hands. "In my line of work," he said finally, his voice a low burr, "I see men use violence to solve their problems every day. It's the easiest, ugliest answer. What you did here, Holt, and you, ma'am, and what the town did, that was harder. You chose the law, even when it was broken. You chose community, even when you were isolated. That's a rare thing." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small, star-shaped badge of beaten tin. It was a deputy's badge, a symbol of temporary authority. "I have to ride on," Vance said. "It may be months before another lawman passes through. I'd consider it a service to the territory if you'd accept this. Not to go looking for trouble, but so that trouble knows that the law has a presence on this mountain." Cal looked at the badge, then at Eliza. He had spent years avoiding any kind of authority, any responsibility for others, but he was not that man anymore. He took the badge. He did not pin it to his shirt. Later that day, after the marshal had gone, he drove a small nail into the thick log wall next to the stone hearth, just above the mantel. He hung the badge there. It was not a symbol of his power, but a reminder of their shared past. It hung there, catching the firelight, a humble star of tin that spoke of a community's choice, of the enduring strength of the human heart, and of the night they had refused to be consumed by the fire. As summer mellowed into the gold and amber hues of early autumn, another visitor made his way up the trail. Reverend Albright arrived not on his usual preaching circuit, but with a different, more solemn purpose, and he was not alone. Behind his mule trotted a second, smaller animal, and perched on its back were two small children, a boy of about 8 with wide, frightened eyes, and a girl of 6 whose thumb was firmly planted in her mouth. They were the children of a miner named Thomas Miller, a man who had perished in the same Silver Queen mine collapse that had claimed Alistair Abernathy. Their mother, a frail woman worn down by grief and hardship, had succumbed to lung fever the week before. They were orphans, with no known kin in the territory. "The town is trying to find a place for them," the Reverend explained, his voice heavy with weariness as he stood in the cabin's doorway. "But folks have little to spare. I thought of you both." He looked from Eliza to Cal, his gaze filled with a hopeful plea. "I remember the words you spoke to me, Cal, about what makes a family." Eliza's heart ached as she looked at the two small, lost souls. They were so thin, their clothes patched and worn, their faces smudged with the dust of the trail and the shadow of grief. She saw in them her own past feelings of being unwanted, of being adrift in a world that had no place for her. She looked at Cal. His face was unreadable, his eyes fixed on the children. She saw the flicker of his old instinct, the urge to retreat, to keep the world and its complications at bay. Their life was just beginning. It was fragile. Grace was only a few months old. To take on 2 more children scarred by loss, was a monumental task. Then, Cal's gaze moved from the children to the cradle, and then to the tin badge glinting by the fire. He looked back at Eliza, and in his eyes, she saw the question and the answer. Their vow, made in the heart of the blizzard, echoed in the quiet space between them, by blood or by heart. It had not been a promise for a hypothetical future. It was a promise for the here and now. Eliza stepped forward, her movements slow and gentle, so as not to frighten the children. She knelt down in front of the little girl. "What's your name?" she asked softly. The little girl took her thumb out of her mouth. "Sarah," she whispered. "And I'm Matthew," the boy said, his voice small but defiant, his arm protectively around his sister's shoulder. "Well, Matthew and Sarah," Eliza said, a warm, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time. "I'm Eliza, and this is Cal, and inside, our daughter, Grace, is sleeping. It smells like we have some fresh gingerbread. Would you like to come inside?" The cabin, which had once felt spacious for one and cozy for two, was now wonderfully, chaotically full. The silence Cal had once cherished was gone, replaced by a symphony of new sounds, the patter of small feet, whispered arguments over a carved wooden horse, Sarah's quiet weeping in the night, and Matthew's endless, curious questions. It was not easy. The children were wounded. Sarah would wake from nightmares, crying for a mother who would never come. Matthew's fear manifested as a prickly, defensive anger. But Eliza and Cal met their pain with a deep, abiding patience. Eliza would hold Sarah, rocking her and humming softly, just as she did with Grace, until the child's sobs subsided into sleep. Cal, seeing a reflection of his own younger, angrier self in Matthew, didn't try to soften the boy with words. Instead, he gave him work. He taught him how to properly stack wood, how to read animal tracks, how to sharpen a knife. One evening, he sat with the boy on the cabin steps and, giving him a small block of soft pine, began to teach him how to whittle, their hands moving together, carving away the boy's sharp edges until a recognizable shape, a small, proud wolf, emerged. The promise was fulfilled. Their family, forged in fire and loss, was now complete, built not just on blood, but on the deliberate, daily choice to love. One afternoon, the supply wagon from Prudence Gulch brought a parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, addressed to Mrs. E. Holt, Bear Spine. Inside was a letter, written in elegant cursive on fine, cream-colored paper. It was from the Women's Benevolent and Emigration Society of Boston. The letter spoke of Reverend Albright, who had written to them of her story. They wrote of their mission to aid and protect women traveling west, and of the dangers and deceptions they faced. They had been moved and inspired by her resilience, by her refusal to be defined by her circumstances. They formally invited her to write a guide, a pamphlet to be distributed to women at the train stations in the East. They wanted her to share her practical knowledge how to make soap, how to mend, how to survive a mountain winter. But more than that, they wanted her to share her story. They wanted her to give a voice to the voiceless. Eliza held the letter, her hands trembling slightly. To write down her story, to expose the shame, the humiliation, the terror. It was a daunting thought, but then she thought of the countless other women like her, women with small, flickering candles of hope, heading west into an unknown future. Women who might be met with a returned letter, with the cold gaze of a man like Tynan Crow. The following Sunday, as the autumn sun cast long shadows across the valley, Cal bundled Grace into a sling on his back, with Matthew and Sarah running ahead. They all hiked up to a high ridge that looked out over their world, a place the old trappers called Old Snow Overlook. From here, they could see everything, the vast rolling expanse of the territory, mountains marching in hazy blue waves toward the horizon, the valley floor, a patchwork of gold and brown, and nestled on the slope of Bear's Spine, a tiny, almost invisible speck, was their homestead, a thin plume of smoke rising from the chimney like a prayer. They stood there for a long time, the wind tugging at their hair, a comfortable family silence settling over them. Below, a herd of deer moved gracefully across a clearing, their coats the color of the turning aspen leaves. They were wild, free, and completely at home in this rugged, beautiful land. Cal shifted the weight of the sleeping baby on his back. He looked at the half-finished line of fence that still needed to be completed before the first snow. He looked at his new family, at the 2 older children chasing a grasshopper, at the woman standing beside him, her face calm and strong as she looked out at the horizon. His world was no longer silent or empty. It was full to bursting with work, with worry, with noise, and with a love so profound it felt as solid and real as the mountain beneath his feet. "Tomorrow, more fence to build," he said, his voice simple, grounded in the reality of their life. He reached out and gently touched his daughter's soft cheek. "Today, just watch her breathe." Eliza smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. She looked out at the vast horizon, a line that was not an end, but a beginning. She thought of the letter, of the invitation to tell her story. She thought of the name they had given her, the mail-order bride. No one wanted. It was true, in a way. She had arrived as a woman nobody seemed to want, but the journey had taught her the only truth that mattered. Her value was never something to be granted by a husband or a contract. Her worth was her own. She had wanted herself, her own survival, her own dignity, her own future. And that was the only wanting that had ever truly mattered. She knew then that she would write the book. She would tell her story, and it would be a story of hope. Thank you for listening to our story. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We'd love to connect and share our thoughts with you. Please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Night, like this video, and give it a boost by hitting the hype button so that this story can be heard by more people.